All right, thanks very much, everybody. So my name is Haofei Yu. I am assistant professor at Civil Environmental and Construction Engineering Department. I'm in environmental engineering. My research focus is primarily focused on air quality. I do air quality modeling. I do air quality sensor network, and I also do air quality and health related studies. So today I'm going to briefly talk about some of the work, a portion of the work I do on air quality health studies. So most likely is on how to track individuals using cell phone and location data. So my background is actually my Ph.D. is for environmental health from UCF. I did the postdoc at Pacific Northwest National Lab at Atmospheric Science Department and Environmental Engineering at Georgia Tech. And here is my contact information and my website if you want to know more of what I do. So the reason I'm interested in human movement, individual movement, is because how individual moves is very important in health studies. People call it contextual exposure because while people move, they are exposed to all kinds of different things, such as violence, disease, things like this. So tracking individual movement in health studies is important, but it's difficult, especially historical studies. For example, if I want to know a pregnancy outcome, if a birth defect is associated with exposure, maybe during 6 months ago, during the first trimester, it's pretty difficult. You need to know where the pregnant lady is from half a year ago. So this is where I want to do the work. If we do not account for movement, human individual movement could become a problem. Just one example is one part of the study. What I did is collect a call detail record that essentially it's if anyone makes a phone call on their cell phone, even say it's a Nokia cell phone, it needs to connect to a cell phone network, and the carrier will record the location and the cell phone network, and you cannot be too far away from there. So it's a server proxy for human location. It's primarily used for criminal investigation, bunch of different purposes. So I was able to get my hands on a big cell phone database of about 300,000 people in China. So what we did is, one example is right here. This is, the image shows here is about 300 location record in one day. And many of the location is at night. So likely this person home. So if we throw this 300,000 people into 4 different categories based on how they move, and if we actually calculate their exposure to air pollution, which is one of the contextual exposures, along the way, we'll be able to see something like that. So different groups corresponding to different levels movement. So the whole idea is in health study, usually people will throw into 4 categories called quartiles. So representing different levels exposures. So if we track individual based on their cell phone data, which is called CDRE, versus we assume the person stay at home, what we can see is with increased human movement, we do see a lot of people was misclassified. It's called misclassification error. And this error is pretty severe in health studies because it will introduce error in health association analysis. This could become a problem. So this is part of my work, basically using big cell phone data to basically understand how human movement impact exposure. But now the problem is, how do we get individual level data? Because CDR data, cell phone data exposure, call data record CDR is private. It's private information. So, so we need to go to individual, into patient asking for their data. But how do we get it? Especially if you want to study historical movement, something already happened in the past. How do we do that? So I'm going to quickly showcase 2 of the data sources I'm exploring. The first one is Google data. So ideally, what we want is something that's easy to access, accurate, complete, good population coverage, because sometimes you don't know who will get some certain disease. For example, pregnancy. You don't know whose baby going to have birth defect, and also good historical availability. Again, if we want, for example, pregnancy outcomes, it needs to happen long time ago, like from the first trimester. So the first data source I want to introduce is Google Maps. Now, the thing with Google Maps, if you use Google Maps, or as a matter of fact, other Google devices, services, what happened is Google in the background, especially on a cell phone, is collecting location data every few minutes. So it was streamed back to Google server. So what I did is basically, this is a new data source. I want to see if this data source is good enough for explorer studies. So what I did is I carried the GPS tracker with me along with the cell phone, a smartphone installed on Google Maps, and for a week. Now here, this shows basically in the proportion of the data. Portion of data, the red dot are Google Maps, the location data. The black little dots are GPS logger data. You can tell this is an intersection. So over the week time period, what I found out is that it depends on accuracy. So if we want to talk about, for example, if I want to see where I was roughly in 1 kilometer resolution, what I can see is basically the x-axis is the time estimate at different locations. Y-axis is that time estimate using Google Maps location data. So if we're looking at the 1 kilometer resolution, Google Maps data is pretty accurate. But if we're looking at, for example, 200-meter resolution, Google Maps location data is a bit wonky. So that's the idea. The idea is, look, it's accurate, but it really depends on how what resolution you're willing to achieve. But sometimes, depending on what you're looking at, what health consequences you want to look at, 1 kilometer is good enough. I also did a survey and it turns out about 60% of the population in the United States have Google Maps data on there from their cell phone. The second source I want to quickly introduce is iPhone data. So a lot of people that have iPhone occupied about 52% of smartphone market share. So the thing with iPhone is, when you turn on your iPhone, it asks you, do you want to continue collecting significant location? And if you turn it on, iPhone in the background, it will start collecting location data stored very deeply in the settings. And I did the same thing. I carried GPS logger with me for a month, and together with iPhone, and compared the two data source. So the whole idea is basically iPhone data. In the month period, I visited about 20-something different locations like Costco. You can tell this is Costco at Winter Park, so you can say, you can tell right away. And so over the month period, iPhone basically pretty accurately captured the time. About 90% of the time, we are spend most of the time at different locations. I also did a survey which shows about 74% of iPhone users in the United States have iPhone data. So the reason I want to show this is because, again, for health studies, a lot of time we want to find patient, we want to find control, and we want to go back. Historically, we want to know where they are. Knowing where they are helps identify how much they are exposed to this contextual exposure, contextual pollution, drug, crime, things like this. With this information, it helps understanding the association between certain health outcomes with the exposure. In the past, it's pretty difficult, but now everybody carrying a smartphone. There are a huge amount of data being hidden inside smartphones. Now, these historical movement data could be extremely helpful for health studies. For near term, what I want to do to continue exploring these different options and to see how the usefulness and these are relatively new data sources. We don't know if people are going to be fine with me poking around with their privacy for research purposes, of course. But for the long term, I hope to use the cellphone data mined from different sources. There are many different sources of location data to collectively compile them and to collectively apply this big data source to an unexplored territory in air pollution health studies and also other sort of health studies. Of course, finally, I would like to acknowledge my funding agency, National Science Foundation, Electrical Power Research Institute, California Air Resource Board, and the Metro Plan Orlando, and of course from many group members and collaborators. Thanks.